dancing, alcohol, gambling, jazz musicals, glittering parties. The United States witnessed a period of economic prosperity in the 1920s. Famously known as the Roaring Twenties, the decade saw an unprecedented economic boom and industrial expansion. Factories produced products at a huge scale and a breakneck speed. Consumerism was at an all-time high. Radios, washing machines, and vacuum cleaners, once considered luxuries, became household staples. For the first time in history, 1 in every 5 Americans owned a car by 1929. The American people had the disposable income to live a life of luxury, leisure, and entertainment. Suddenly, it all came to an end. Poverty, unemployment, breadlines, soup kitchens, shanty towns. The 1930s witnessed a severe economic depression in the United States. Industrial production fell dramatically. Factories laid off their workers and businesses shut down. Farmers lost their lands and agriculture failed to feed the population. Inflation skyrocketed and people couldn't afford to buy food, much less necessary items. Men, women, and children walked in the street with no shoes, in rags and tatters, and with no prospects in sight. America suffered one of the most terrible and darkest episodes in human history. In this video, we will discover the 3 major mistakes that brought about the Great Depression in the United States of America. Stay with me and let's get started. After World War I, the United States was riding a wave of optimism and prosperity. The 1920s was a period of industrial growth and rising consumerism. The buy now, pay later slogan was the highlight of the American economy at the time. Americans bought cars and household appliances on credit. Ceaseless advertising created an endless desire for the latest products, and consumer culture spread in America. The irony was that many people did not have much money to sustain this frivolous lifestyle. So the banks, easy to fuel growth, offered easy credit. Loans were given to people without rigorous checks on their ability to repay debts. This easy access to money created a false sense of prosperity because in reality, millions of Americans were buying things they couldn't actually afford. In fact, America's wealth was unevenly distributed during the 1920s. The richest 1% controlled nearly a third of the nation's wealth, while most Americans lived beyond their means. This illusion of wealth was doomed to shatter, setting the stage for the infamous stock market crash of 1929. In the 1920s, the stock market was the heart of the American economy. Everyone wanted to get rich quickly, and the stock market seemed like the perfect place. 1 American in 3 invested his savings in the stock market. By 1929, $2 billion were invested on Wall Street. As easy credit fueled the economy, it spilled into the stock market. Investors no longer bought stocks with their money. They bought them on credit from stockbrokers. Buying on margin was an easy, albeit a highly risky scheme. Let's say an investor wanted to buy a stock worth $100. They only paid 10%, which is $10, and borrowed the rest from a stockbroker who lent them the remaining $90. If the stock price went up $10, the investor could sell, pay back the $90 loan, and have a $20 profit, 100% return on investment. But this was a great gamble, because if the stock went down just 10%, the investor lost everything and still owed the broker. Despite this great risk, the American people were confident in the economy and thought that prosperity was endless. Motivated by greed and the desire for huge, quick profits, the stock market drew millions of new, inexperienced investors into the market. But in truth, the stock market had become a big gambling casino. Stock prices weren't based on the actual value or earnings of the companies. They were mostly based on speculation. After all, the US government, led by Herbert Hoover, did not intervene and took no part in regulating the banks or the stock market. In fact, most political and financial leaders celebrated this reckless speculation, believing the economy will further prosper. But they were dead wrong. On October 24th, 1929, Black Thursday, 13 million stocks were suddenly dumped on the market by panic-stricken shareholders, sending stock prices down dramatically. After 3 years of reckless speculation, the speculative bubble burst, causing financial panic. Through a domino effect, the whole of the stock market collapsed. The cumulative losses amounted to $30 billion, 10 times the US Federal Reserve budget and more than the United States had spent during the whole of World War I. After that, panic and chaos ensued. A run on the bank began. Millions of Americans who were afraid their savings were gone rushed to withdraw money from the bank. But the banks had no money to give. The American people lost their life savings, and individuals and businesses couldn't sustain their costs, leading to massive unemployment and a downward spiral of recession. Even the future British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who had invested much of his money in the US stock market, lost his wealth in the crash and suffered huge financial losses. Watch our video on Churchill's shocking mistakes to learn more about his financial blunders. The Wall Street crash of 1929 was the final straw that broke the American economy and triggered the Great Depression of the 1930s.
The result of the World War and its aftermath.
In 1930, President Herbert Hoover raised tariffs on foreign imports, aiming to protect American jobs and provide relief to the struggling economy. This was a devastating measure and a monumental mistake. Foreign nations, which were subject to this act, retaliated with tariffs of their own, further straining international trade, worsening the depression and spreading it across the globe. Furthermore, President Hoover decided to urgently repatriate capital loans from Germany to the US in order to boost confidence in the American economy. But this turned out to be a terrible mistake. Germany, which was barely recovering from the war, was hit hard by the withdrawal of American capital. The German banks collapsed in no time, unemployment soared, bread lines and soup kitchens sprouted, and the country was thrown into turmoil, so much so that it gave rise to extremism, paving the way for Nazi Germany and the onset of World War II. Watch our video on Hitler's rise to power and his deadly mistakes in the war. The depression didn't stop there. It kept spiraling out of control. In 1931, a major Austrian bank collapsed under the weight of economic pressures, triggering a destructive chain reaction that swept across Europe and caused a financial crisis. Britain, which had rooting interests in Europe, suffered massive financial losses and eventually abandoned the gold standard in 1931, further destabilizing global currencies. In essence, this proves just how interconnected the global financial system is and how an untimely trade war could plague the entire world and change the course of history. The Great Depression shattered millions of lives in the United States. But from the ashes of the Depression arose a strong man who took charge of the situation and worked to reform the American economy. Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected President of the United States in 1932. He introduced the New Deal, a promising policy aimed at reforming the American economy. And indeed, his policy regulated the market, reduced unemployment, and restored American confidence. Eventually, the Great Depression was ultimately resolved by the crucible of war. The rapid buildup of military spending to fight World War II restored American production and eliminated unemployment overnight. The only question that remains is, what lessons can we learn from the Great Depression? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you have found this video useful, make sure to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more videos on the mistakes of history. Thank you for watching and see you next time.